Ladies and gentlemen, please be so kind to take your seats so that we can get this panel started. Thank you so much. Please make your way into the hall and take your seats as swiftly as you can so that we can get the second panel of day 2 started. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this coffee break, and for those who joined the signatory ceremony between the EIB and the European Commission, which took place in the delegate room. The next panel is going to address a very timely topic that has been mentioned yesterday and today for obvious reasons, namely energy security and the green transition. And I'm very delighted to hand over to the Vice President of the EIB, Mr. Thomas Östros, who will be moderating the session. Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the panel this morning that is about energy and energy transition. And as you've all heard in almost all other discussion and interventions yesterday and today, we touch upon the energy issue. So it is really very topical to have that debate here today. I have with me an excellent panel that can help us to guide both the public and private viewpoints on energy transition. And let me shortly introduce Kurt Vandenberg, Director General of the Director General Climate Action of the European Commission, to my right. Dimitri Papalexopoulos, Chairman of Titan Cement Group, and also Chair of the European Roundtable for Industry, Working Group on Energy Transition and Climate Change. Very important, of course. Arina Freitag, Chief Financial Officer of the European Electricity Grid Operator, TEN-T, and Laura Piovesan, Deputy Director General, Projects Directorate in our own bank, EIB. And as has been mentioned by the President yesterday in many debates during this conference, we have two interlinked issues to deal with here. Of course, the thing that we dealt with also very much before the outbreak of the war and the invasion of Ukraine, we have the decarbonization and the transition towards sustainable, clean and green energy. But now, on top of the agenda is also energy security following the invasion of Ukraine and the efforts to reduce European reliance on Russian gas. And these two themes will be, I think, very topical also in this debate. To succeed in a transition towards a truly green, sustainable and affordable energy economy and strengthen European competitiveness at the same time, the overarching question we will pose today is, do we need more European initiatives? Do we need more of cooperation to be able to handle this challenge? To build a true clean energy union has always been a high priority due to the climate crisis, but it is even more important now than ever. Energy savings, energy diversification, and acceleration of clean energy transition will be key. And we need to have financial flows that floats into these areas so that we can really support this transition. The Commission has identified investment needs, reforms and financing tools for the clean energy transition. The EIB Investment Survey, as well as the EIB report on barriers to investment, have identified several challenges, but also, of course, opportunities. The key is private sector engagement and leadership also in the transition. So just a few words on how we work on this. EIB has been a big, substantial energy financier for a long time. Steady state, we usually finance about 12 billion per year in energy-related investments. Last year was for us a record year, 17 billion devoted for energy in broad terms. But that is not enough. A few months ago, our board took the decision to increase our support to Repower EU by devoting another 30 billion euros on top of what we already do in a 5-year period to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and transmission of energy. And we count that this will mean additional 115 billion of investments totally. So that is an extraordinary measure, but as you heard the President yesterday, we are also ready, if our shareholders support, to go even further. This is, of course, an important theme also to discuss today. So I will start the panel debate with the views from the Commission, because that sets sort of the ground for what we are discussing. I mean, regulation, incentives, investments are so important. And then I will turn to our two private sector representatives, and in the end I will let also our EIB representative express her views. But if I begin with you, Kurt, we need an enabling policy framework, and the Commission has taken a lot of initiatives to establish that enabling framework. Will it now allow for the acceleration of investment that is needed? Do we have the necessary EU tools in front of us to be used, or do we need further initiatives to be able to reach these ambitious targets? Please, Kurt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for having me today in this panel. Very glad to be here in Luxembourg with all of you. Thank you also for drawing attention to, indeed, the importance of the EU policy framework. And I believe it's fair to say that within Europe, we are now putting in place the regulatory and funding framework that is needed for making this transition happen and giving certainty, predictability to investors, to business, to economic operators. That is key, of course, because if there is no certainty that this transition will last and that Europe is certain about this, then we don't secure that in the investments that are needed, because this is really about an economic transition if we want to make this decarbonization work. I remember that when in 2019 we presented the European Green Deal as our blueprint for this clean energy transition and the green transition of our economy overall, we were often criticized for being alone in the world. Today, it feels very different. Today, actually, the whole world, and certainly our major economic partners and competitors, are moving a lot in this space as well, maybe even quicker than we do. So it's there's no need anymore to explain why the European Green Deal is about securing and strengthening Europe's competitive advantage. And why, since the dreadful events in Ukraine and the consequences on energy, the Green Deal and the climate neutrality mission that we have is also going hand in hand with our agenda of energy security. We have now seen firsthand what it means to be dependent on the imports of fossil fuels and how vulnerable that makes us. I looked up the figures again this morning. In 2019, Europe imported close to 300 billion euros of energy, fossil energy. In 2021, that rose to more than 500 billion. And in the third quarter of 2022, the monthly import of fossil energy from the rest of the world was in the range of 70 billion per month. So we're probably getting close to or above 1 trillion euros of fossil imports in 1 year, which is actually double the amount of investment that the Commission has estimated is needed per year between now and 2030 to achieve the targets that we have set for the clean energy transition and the decarbonization. So we have the framework, regulatory speaking, gradually put in place. We have the European Climate Law, which is given security up to 2050. And it shows the determination of Europe. 27 member states have agreed democratically to this. We have the Fit for 55 package that was, as far as the climate proposals are concerned, agreed in December, much quicker than we all had thought. And we are putting in place and have increasingly in place the funding also for this. I will not name them all, but you know that the multi-annual financial framework plays a role, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, where 40% is now dedicated to green and climate investment. But also, for example, looking at ETS, we have now agreed with the member states that all the ETS revenues between now and 2030, which will run in the hundreds of billions of euros, will have to be invested in energy and climate. This is now an obligation on member states. So that frees up a lot of funding opportunities that hopefully will catalyze the investment, for which of course we count on the EIB as our major partner in this endeavor, and on the private sector, where obviously, as you also said, the investment will really need to happen. Maybe two last points before I close. The acceleration is happening as we speak. We all read in The Economist 2 weeks ago that actually, because of the recent events, the clean energy transition has been fast-tracked in Europe by 5 to 10 years. So the acceleration is happening. Ember, a think tank, has published this morning a notice saying that Europe is on track to reach more than 40% of renewable energy by 2030. So the 45% renewable target that we have proposed is doable. And what I would like to say is where we still need to work is on the industrial competitiveness of this. The IRA is a wake-up call for all of us. It is good that the IRA is there as a declaration of determination by the US that they will also make this transition. But Europe now has to get its act together so that we keep the industries that we need also for this green transition in Europe. Because with Fit for 55, we're creating a massive market in the future for clean and green solutions. We will not be able to sustain that climate ambition if these solutions are not also supplied from within Europe. So that is what will keep us busy in the weeks and months to come. You've all seen the Green Deal investment industrial plan. We are working towards a series of proposals on the 14th of March, and that is really to help really boost even more the investment that is needed to make this transition happen. So yes, the framework is getting into place. Yes, the acceleration is happening, but yes, we need some more tools for industrial competitiveness.
Thank you, Kurt. Very clear message. Let's turn now to Dimitri. You are very well placed to be in the middle of this transition. I mean, leading an energy-intensive industry, cement industry, at the same time leading the working group in the European Roundtable and having a broad perspective on industrial challenges. So, to keep competitiveness and preferably increase competitiveness and at the same time do this quite substantial transition, where do you see we are on that? Give us your perspective, please.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for the invitation to present the view of energy-intensive industry in Europe. Sometime late last year, the European Roundtable for Industry, which is not known as an organization that's particularly susceptible to existential crisis for European industry. And indeed, there were several factors in 22 that led people to worry. One was obviously that we saw a big increase in local production being substituted by imports in energy-intensive sectors, across several sectors in a meaningful way. But more importantly, because you could argue part of that was temporary, but more importantly, there were strong statements to the effect that investment for the future of industry was moving or risk moving outside of Europe. Now, as usual in cases like this, is not a single reason why this happened, but a combination of reasons. One is obviously energy costs. Even after coming down from the crazy levels of last year, it is clear that Europe will have to compete with a disadvantage of structurally higher, significantly higher energy costs for the next 5 to 10 years at least. A second challenge is that at the same time as Europe is doing the right thing by internalizing the cost of carbon, expanding the ETS to all sectors, phasing out free allowances, most of the rest of the world is not following the same route. They are taking initiative, but they're not following the same route. And that leads to the likely fact that in the second half of this decade, European industry, energy-intensive industry, will have to rely for its competitiveness on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that is something that is controversial inside and outside Europe. It is viewed as absolutely essential, but at the same time, very difficult to implement, bureaucratic nightmare, and possible to game. So with a lot of concerns as to how it will be implemented. And that's why the phasing in and the testing, I think, is so important. A third thing that happened last year was, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act of the US. And although that is clearly a good thing for the planet, because the US is finally joining meaningfully the race to decarbonize, the way that they did it, saying we cannot put a price on carbon in the US, therefore instead of using sticks, we will use carrots, big American carrots. So the way they have done it further tilts the playing field against European companies that have to compete against those incentives. And we are seeing companies, European companies, committing more money to the US than Europe in the recent past. And finally, the fourth thing that is happening is that there is a fraying at the seams of the free trade world order, with increasing number of countries around the world taking a more protectionist, a more state-led view as opposed to a free market, free trade view. So put all these things together and you have a crisis. Unfortunately, I have to say that the urgency and that message has been received in Brussels and the European capitals, and we've seen a number of initiatives in that regard. The net zero industrial plan is absolutely a step in the right direction. We're looking forward to the next step on I think it's the 14th of March. But there's clearly still a lot to be done. And given that I'm not a policy specialist, rather than go into the details, and maybe we have an opportunity to go later, let me outline some of the basic principles I think most people in business I talk to seem to agree on as a general direction. The first is clearly that the crisis should in no way be an excuse to dilute our climate ambitions. If anything, we should accelerate them. And I can say that certainly all members of ERT, but also most companies I talk to, that train has left the station a long time ago, that there's no going back, and it's an opportunity to go faster. Second, a lot of people are saying, what can we learn from the IRA? Not the protectionist part, but how about, you may think of it as simplistic, but it is simple and it's fast. How can we take, as Europe, within our constraints, within our way of doing things, within the context of having 27 countries having to agree, how can we go from controlling to enabling? How can we go from just making sure everything is done right to making sure it's simple and can therefore move as fast as it needs to move? So a mind shift change. Third, a lot of people are saying we are not doing enough on the easy, non-controversial win-wins. We can do a lot more on efficiency. We can do a lot more to leverage the digital tools we have to accelerate the green transition and help the energy efficiency in a number of ways. We have to accelerate the permitting. We have to accelerate the skills, things that I think we can all agree on, and the question is not whether to do them, but how to do them. Fourth, and I'm sure that we will talk about this later, there is a strong feeling that we have to massively invest in energy infrastructure and massively invest in accelerating the European Common Market Energy project. So there is clearly we need more Europe, and clearly for all the difficulties, by overcoming the national interests, we have all a lot more to gain. Fifth, there is still a lot of people are saying we are pushing, but there's no pulling. There's still very little interest in most cases from the consumer So there's a lot to be done in trying to spur demand. The public sector, through its procurement, through its policies, can do a lot in that regard. Contracts for difference are a useful tool that was discussed in the previous panel as well. Sixth, and here we get more controversial, I think there is strong support for a targeted and temporary significant increase in support for breakthrough innovation and for transformative initiatives. We should not imperil our acquis communautaire on state aid, on the common market. But these are extraordinary circumstances. We need to accelerate massively in the context of the headwinds I described, and a significant exception, I think most people in the private sector feel is appropriate. And there, I think it's also, in order to preserve value added for Europe and increase Europe's ability to innovate, which is crucial, one should not only focus on green tech and the energy sector, but also on transforming existing industry as well, and it's important for them not to be excluded. Last point, Europe is and should be the defender of fair trade and free trade. We should in no way give in to the temptation to local content, protectionist policies of any kind. But it is also, I think, increasingly becoming a broader understanding that the approach should be nuanced and not naive. We need a muscular free trade policy, and I'm unfortunately so far from that I don't need to explain what I mean, because I don't know what I mean. It's for other people to translate that into reality. So all in all, when history is written in 2050 and a decarbonized, innovative, thriving European industry is around to tell the story, I think we will look back at 2022 as a starting point for a much different transformation. And that's the way I would interpret the cry for rallying cry of the year T last year.
Thanks, Dimitri. You touched upon so many interesting issues, so I guess other panelists will also pick up on some of these, and I encourage you to do in the debate going forward. One thing that you mentioned, breakthrough technologies. I think that is super key, and I would ask Laura to prepare a little bit, because our cooperation from EIB side with the Commission on guarantees, and specifically, for instance, energy demonstration plans that we've been able to do thanks to the Commission's support. High risk, but also possibility to very high impact is key, and that could of course be scaled up if wanted. But I would like to turn to Arina. Dimitri also mentioned the connections. And if there's something that we have learned during this crisis, is that it is not only about transmission within a country, it is also very much cross-border transition that is needed if we're going to handle the issues that we have seen lately. And you represent one of Europe's largest transmission service operators and one of the first cross-border operators. And we now meet the enormous electrification challenge that we have. The demand for electricity will increase very substantially, and transmission will be totally key to be able to deal with different sources of energy. So I would like you to say a little bit about your points of view here, and how we can have both an affordable, reliant and green energy with your help in transmission investments. Please, you have the floor.
Yeah, Thomas, thank you. Well, affordable and reliable and safe grid, I think that's really in the heart of TenneT, and we have over 7,700 employees now that really work on that. And what we are definitely seeing is great cooperation among politicians, among the industry now, also among countries. We do build and maintain the electricity grid in the Netherlands and in part of Germany. And if I really look back, we have invested more than 4 billion euros per year in that electricity grid. And we do plan to invest more than 6 billion per year on an annual basis. And if we're really looking over the next 10-year horizon, For both countries, we do foresee an investment volume of over 111 billion euros, and for a company of our size, that is massive. And if you really look into the future, what do you need for that? We do need really a whole set of suppliers that help us to connect offshore to onshore electricity grid. And for us, it's basically really keying on the North Sea as the powerhouse of Europe. And also as TenneT, we will build 40 gigawatt out of 65 gigawatt really connections until 2030. So that is also very, very massive. And there you definitely need good framework contracts with suppliers. So what we are definitely seeing, well, the IRA, that is definitely a topic we are looking into. And for us, it's very essential to be fast and also to talk to our shareholder, or our current shareholder, that's the Dutch Ministry of Finance at the moment, and also to the German government at the moment, just to make sure we have good contracts. That's also an issue on procurement with suppliers. And also we do see the huge suppliers that do develop, that do provide in the future offshore platforms. They they need security over a longer horizon in order to build up capacities, and also to employ and to educate the right people. So it's also, we really have to key on how do we get more people attracted into the energy sector to become really an employer of choice and also a supplier of choice. So that is pretty much what we are keying on. And at the end, it's all about international cooperation, it's about European cooperation. That is for us the key. And I think for the year 2022 and also this year, I think it's a great year where we, I think, all got together also on the political level, and we have been quite courageous also to come up with legislation to speed up the planning procedure, because for us it's in order to really implement parts of our investment and our energy infrastructure. On average, it takes 8 years, and 80% of that time is usually used up just in that planning and permitting procedures. So if we could speed that up, that's very crucial to us. And if I really look also in the future, we have great relations with you, with the European Investment Bank. We are there, and we have taken out over 2 billion of loans, and I think we have to go further there. So we have continuous huge capital needs, and we have issued green bonds. Last year, 6.85 billion just green bonds. What does that mean also to a company? You suddenly need to steer a company totally differently if you're going into green finance. That's a different steering. You have to really comply to ESG standards, and you need to continue to do that. For us also in the future, given that huge investment volume we have, our financial stability and also the collaboration with you, that is very, very key for our success.
Thank you so much. So massive investments are planned, but at the same time you are struggling with very long permitting processes. That is, I think, that is common for every EU country, not least the country that I know best. I mean, strong ideas, but it takes some time before it's implemented. It would be interesting to hear also Kurt develop his thoughts on that. But first to Laura, as an EIB representative. You also work a lot with identifying the challenges and the barriers to investment. If you could touch a little bit about the role of the EIB, but also the barriers report and what type of challenges you see there. Please, Laura.
Thank you, Vice President, and good morning, everyone. And indeed, both yesterday and today, it emerges that the clean energy transition can be not only the opportunity for Europe to tackle the climate crisis, but also to become more resilient and more competitiveness. So massive investments needed, an acceleration of investments needed, which is already underway, but we do observe on the ground when financing projects in the energy sector a number of barriers which are complement the one that our chief economist, Deborah, identified in the investment survey, and very, very specific. And I think the first one, Rina already mentioned it, and it's very, very visible, which is the length of the planning and permitting processes. Up to 10 years can be needed to implement the transmissions and the electricity grids that are needed to connect the renewables to the grids. And while several measures have been taken by the European Commission, and I'm sure Kurt will mention the new emergency framework, now the focus needs to be on implementation of this measure. And a fast-track permitting process with clear deadlines for each step of the process itself, I think can unblock further investments. And the second barrier that we observe is the fact that EU markets are very fragmented. So this lack of harmonized standards is something we observe in different industries, and it's also the case for the energy sector. So renewable energy projects, infrastructure projects, they are implemented at national level as part of national schemes. But the cost, the regulatory costs which are linked to this fragmentation can be very high. And similarly, we spoke about the innovation needed in clean tech manufacturing, not only for the energy sector, but also for industry and industry decarbonization, and there as well a functioning single market. Having harmonized, common, clear standards will really help and catalyze and push this innovation needed in order to bring down the cost of these technologies, but also bring to the market technologies that are not yet available. And maybe a third barrier that I would like to mention, but also links then to one of the roles of the EIB, is the volatility of the electricity market. So high market prices, high electricity prices are disincentivizing investment sometimes, and the volatility, the uncertainty sends very ambiguous signals. So there as well we see progress. We see the European Commission is indeed working on a very much needed reform of the electricity market. But at the same time, as investors, as lenders, we see the importance of long-term arrangements to be able indeed to allow for bankable projects. I'm talking about credit for difference, but it was already mentioned, but also power purchase agreements, and indeed targeted support for innovative technologies, for the demonstration stages in particularly, for the early deployment on a large scale of these technologies that are going to indeed drive the transition. We have had very good experience with this type of targeted intervention through, for example, Innofin, developed in partnership with the Commission, but also now rolled out more on InvestEU, which enables us to support the demonstration projects, the projects that are opening up the way for others, for example, with Northvolt battery production in Sweden. So now, if these three types of barriers, which is what we see as most urgent, are addressed, I think indeed progress can be accelerated, but at the same time, there is the need to bring down the low the cost of financing these investments, given in order to make the transition, the clean energy transition, accessible. So here, a role to play for the bank, already mentioned the increasing in our lending, but also our willingness to do more. Also a role to play for the capital markets, and we do indeed see a role in developing further the green bonds as an instrument, which is of course important also for the bank. And through the green bonds, the investors have the visibility, can track the flow of the funding towards true green investments. The taxonomy, the European taxonomy, has provided a common definition of what is green, what is a green investment. And now I think we need to push forward with the implementation of this framework.
Thank you so much, Laura. I will suggest that the audience start to prepare which questions you would like to pose to the panel. But while you are thinking about that, let me return to the panelists and ask you for a brief intervention each on if you prioritize really and take the two most important key actions that should be delivered as soon as possible to reach the green transition and still have a very strong competitiveness, what would that be? And if you briefly comment on one of your colleagues' interventions, if you want to, in that intervention also. So please, Kurt, you have the floor.
Well, I think it's very good that we look at the investment barriers, and there the report from the EIB is very helpful. And I think there are a couple that were mentioned. One that I really want to point out is indeed the permitting, where we need to do a lot more than what we've done so far. You mentioned indeed the emergency regulations that we put on the table last year. We've also proposed through the Renewable Energy Directive new provisions to accelerate permitting, where we would ask the member states to identify go-to areas which would have a strategic impact, environmental impact assessment. And then within those go-to areas, the project authorization would happen very, very quickly, even within 6 months, which would be really a big win on the current timeframes, where we see sometimes it can take up to 8 or more years. We're now trying to also see how this could apply to industrial investment, so permitting acceleration for industrial investment. That's what we're looking at for the Net Zero Industry Act, because also there the permitting has to go much more quicker. We are, of course, in the hands of member states as well. So we are now increasingly taking regulatory initiatives to help member states overcome all the bureaucratic hurdles that are there without encroaching or infringing on the law that exists, because we don't want member states to push into unlawful behavior. But there's a lot of capacity building that is also needed at all levels, national, regional, and local. So permitting is definitely one of the big issues. The second big issue that we are working on is, as Dimitri was saying, making our funding fast, simple, and predictable. And we have heard the message loud and clear in the Commission that we need to do much better to help the manufacturing sector within Europe. For example, for hydrogen production, but also for clean tech manufacturing. One illustration of this is that we will now use the new modalities of the Innovation Fund that is resourced by the revenues of the ETS, the Emission Trading System, not only to fund innovation and breakthrough innovation projects, where I agree with you, a lot more is needed, and if the EIB can also help us further in that space, that would be very much welcome. Investing, co-investing with the private sector, where the private sector alone would not go. But we're also now gearing up for having competitive bids at European level, giving a fixed premium during 10 years for the production of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, and clean tech manufacturing. This is something we've never done before. It's entirely new. It's going to be a very direct response to the IRA in the United States. And what we're also working on now is to facilitate the situation for member states, so that if we get a lot of bids that cannot be funded because lack of money at the European level, that the member states can come in and support these projects with the revenues they have from ETS or from their RRF, their Recovery and Resilience Funds, for example. And again, there we're working very well with the EIB, which has developed a very good advisory service to help bidders, prospective bidders, make their bid. Especially also in member states which have less experience with bidding for the Innovation Fund. If there the EIB can help prospective bidders to already give, maybe on conditional terms, some instruments that make their bid even more advantageous, that of course would increase the attractiveness even more of the Innovation Fund. Because it's very clear to us, we need manufacturing, we need clean tech production in Europe. We also need energy-intensive industries to stay within Europe. There are many more investment barriers and priorities that we have, but permitting and making our funding fast, attractive, simple and predictable are certainly two I want to highlight.
Very clear, Kurt. Dimitri, please.
2 points I think I'd like to emphasize. One has already been covered by Kurt significantly. We need the Green Deal industrial plan to be, I don't know the right word, brave, comprehensive, big, daring, and what I hear is all encouraging, and we have to make it work. The second point I'd like to make is I think we need, as Europe, and this is a personal opinion, to spend more time looking outwards with global diplomacy. We tend to be self-referencing, and we are still just 7% of world emissions, and I don't know what percent of energy consumption in the world. And the success of this long term is not about Europe, it's about the world. And if we don't engage more meaningfully in a ways we don't like with the Americans, with the developing world, with India, and it cannot just be the COP process. So I think a much more muscular, externally oriented diplomatic effort. I don't know if Article 6 is the right basis, but that's something to focus on. And we have some time until 2026 to make that work.
Thank you, and your second point is really true. Just a couple of days ago, I was in Nairobi signing a memorandum of understanding on cooperating with the Kenyan government on green hydrogen. So I mean, we need to have this outward-looking perspective to be able to solve these issues. Arina, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, well, if I especially key on financial markets, I think it's not only pretty much the government that needs to do a trick, but I think what I also see that private investors can also play a crucial role in financing at least a part of the huge energy investments we have ahead of us. And there I also see that we need to really strengthen the dialogue with the regulators. The energy sector is heavily regulated, and I must really say that investors definitely look at the return on the investments they're getting. And here I see we need to have really a higher return on the investments. And that for a longer time, I think that will also attract for a longer time private investors. So it's not only the state that needs to chip in, but we are very attractive also to private investors. And I think there they can also support us for really bringing the energy transition about. I think a second point I'd like to mention is really the good cooperation among states. We need to continue to have really national states cooperating, especially in that North Sea energy development, offshore development. That's very important. And of course, we also need to educate our employees and also future employees, and that is also a fun part to really work on that energy transition. So it's all keying on training as well.
Thank you. Very clear priorities. Laura, if you have a short intervention on 2 priorities that you would like to highlight.
Yes, no, indeed. And being the last of this very rich discussion, I can build on my co-panelist here. So maybe one key point I wanted to make is, of course, about innovation. And I think no one can understate the role of innovation. As EIB, we have been supporting clean tech manufacturing, and we see that Europe can have a pioneering role, has had a pioneering role in a number of technologies, and offshore wind is one, for example, but we cannot be complacent because of this competition for both investment and skills. And going forward, green innovation is needed in the production of renewable energy, in energy storage, in the decarbonization of industries. And while technologies are at different level of maturity, innovation can bring down the scope, this cost, help scale up this technology economically and competitively, broaden the application of certain technologies, and also build the technologies of the future by investing in longer term. To enable this innovation, scaling up the capacity of finance to de-risk these projects, these innovative projects, is crucial. This morning also Vice President Vestager mentioned the InvestEU as a good example, model to de-risking. Kurt mentioned the Innovation Fund as a way to de-risk through advice provided to companies. And all these are models which are present, which we have. It's a toolbox we have. We do not need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to scale up, really increase the investments. One second action, maybe very briefly, building on what Dimitri was saying, global partnership. Indeed, we cannot do this acceleration alone. Building supply chains and resilient supply chain inside Europe is important, but it's equally important to build a global partnership, to diversify the supply chains and build them in a different way, in a win-win approach. So bringing our technologies, our environmental and social standards to this global partnership and making them true partnership, true equal footing.
Thank you so much, Laura. And now I turn to the audience and encourage you to put forward questions. Start by introducing yourself, and please try to be brief. I have a question in the back side here. Do we have anyone with a microphone that is? Yes, I think we have a runner here that is coming with the mic. So please, you have the floor.
So I'm working the solar industry in Europe. So for a sustainable solar industry and development, the value chain is very long. It's composed of several sectors: equipment producers, provider of raw materials, production companies, and users. Of course, users it's the easiest part. So when we talk about massive investment into renewable solar, is there any possibility that a part, so one sector profits most? What I talked with last 10 years, the deployment companies or the users, that actually detriment the other sectors. We see how our equipment producers, how they lost this campaign completely. Raw material providers, they fight with high energy price, and we have almost no production companies anymore. Have you ever thought about balancing a little bit all these sectors that compose what we call PV industry in Europe?
Thank you very much. We also have a question in the midsection here, a raised hand, if you can get the microphone there. I think it is coming behind you there. Please, you have the floor. We take a couple of questions.
Thank you very much. I'm a Spanish diplomat working in Brussels at the Spanish Permanent. I would have two questions. One is related to the previous panel, where someone was mentioning the idea of Europeanizing subsidies for energy and being more efficient if we are concentrating these subsidies in the most efficient countries in terms of solar. So mentioning, of course, the Mediterranean ones. So your position on that. And my second question or comment is on the presence, together with you here in the panel, someone representing the consumers or the civil society in general. Had you have that in mind, or is it maybe a proposal for next time? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shall we take a round of answers? I think, Kurt, you are well placed to handle also the solar question, but also maybe Laura would like to react on that. Please, Kurt.
Yes, on the solar equipment manufacturers, indeed, some are in a very challenging situation. Not only solar, but also especially the wind sector, for the wind energy sector. We see a few good developments in terms of public procurement, where a number of governments, notably in the Netherlands, for example, are now launching procurements where there is more than the price, and that they give a premium of, for example, 30% for other factors than simply the price, to factor in innovation, quality, etc. One thing that we're also looking at the Commission is to factor in public procurement tenders the notion of security of supply. I don't know if you've seen this, but 2 weeks ago the Commission made a proposal on CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles, for trucks and buses. We have proposed that by 2030 all urban buses should be electric. But we have introduced the notion that when public procurement is done, a certain percentage of the criteria can be weighted against security of supply for Europe, so that we keep and strengthen certain expertise and manufacturing bases in Europe. What we will also do is increasingly use European funds to look at the deficiencies or gaps in our supply chains, and then help those elements in the supply chain where there is support needed, so that we keep our value chains in Europe as intact as possible. But it is a very, very pertinent and relevant question. And certainly looking at the whole value chain is necessary. In terms of Europeanizing subsidies, I think as Dimitri has said, and I would fully agree, more Europe is needed in everything. So the more we can do it together at European level, the better. We're trying to do that through different channels. For example, we're working hard on the Trans-European energy networks as a planning tool. We are introducing all kinds of obligations, regulatory obligations through the Renewable Energy Directive. Who would have thought, for example, a year ago that the Commission would be so daring to impose on all buildings by 2029 solar rooftop. That is at least what we have proposed, an obligation on all houses in Europe, including residential, as of 2029. That opens up a whole new market as well, and this is a very European approach. We're working with a Solar Alliance, for example, with the industry. So we're trying all the tools we have in our toolbox to have more European coordination, so that the investment goes to where it is the most cost effective and cost efficient indeed. But dictating from Brussels who should do what in the space of solar panel deployment, that of course would be quite politically going a step too far at this stage, I think.
Laura first with a short intervention, and then Dimitri.
Very, very shortly, indeed, I mean, we do see the importance of accelerating the deployment of renewable energy, in particular because renewable energies is often now the most competitive, the lowest cost power generation technology. So we need to reap the cost of the solar and wind, for example, where it's least costly, while at the same time building and modernizing the electricity grids and building the interconnectors that allow us to have the flexibility. So, I mean, on one side, then the market pull, and on the other side, we do see that when locating manufacturing in Europe, this also brings in the supply chains around it, as well as builds the skills around it. So it is a win-win situation where we can build on going forward in Europe.
Thanks, Laura. Dimitri, and take into consideration that we have 1.5 minutes left.
Just wanted to generalize the question by answering, by starting photovoltaics. 15 years ago as Europe, we invested massively in subsidies for photovoltaics. And today, we have almost zero value added in Europe. It's not the same with wind turbines, better story. The question I have, and I'm generalizing as a question, is how can we make sure when we're investing so much in hydrogen, in carbon capture, in a number of other areas, that the value added stays significantly in Europe?
And last question to Arina. Are we bold enough to handle this new environment with massive investment in solar and in wind when it comes to the transmission? To see to that we have effective cross-border transmission that can deal with the balancing of this system.
Now, I think if we keep cooperating among countries and among companies, then we are definitely bold enough and we can definitely manage. It's all about cooperation.
And thank you so much. I think it's time for us to wrap up because we have an interesting keynote speech coming in just a few seconds. I would like to thank all the panelists and thank the audience for the questions. And let's continue this conversation in the next coffee break. I think we all are ready for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed for this very interesting and insightful panel discussion. And thank you so much for finishing up right on time, because indeed, before the lunch break, we have a very exciting keynote session ahead of us. To introduce our keynote speaker, it is my great pleasure to hand over to Ambroise Fayol to join us at the podium and introduce our esteemed guests.